Hello party people, set 4 is here and we've got the first set of tournaments which have come through. There's not really that many big tournaments that happened. This one happened in Germany at Battle Bear Trading Cards and Games. 48 players, so a decent amount of people. So I thought it'd be pretty interesting to take a look at the top 8 decks from this tournament. Obviously, bear in mind, this is the first week of the set, so it's incredibly unlikely that these decks are going to be super optimized, simply for many reasons. Obviously, the set is brand new. Also, players are going to be limited in what cards they actually have access to. But also, this still gives us a lot of good information over what decks are performing really well, which kind of decks to look out for as the meta develops. We're starting off here with a Ruby Sapphire deck, which is my early contender for front runner of best deck in set number 4. It was one of the strongest decks already in set 3. Of course, has some pretty difficult matchups into those quicker decks. However, it has incredible matchups into a lot of the very popular meta decks. Things like Amber Steel Songs really struggles to deal with Ruby Sapphire. Heavy control. And it got a few new tools. In particular, it got the new Ice Block card here, which is an incredible card when combined with things like Madame Medusa in particular. You can exert it once per turn, and a chosen character gets -1 strength. So if you've got 2 Ice Blocks down, very few cards in the game are safe from Madame Medusa. Like a Tamatoa, for example, could be tapped twice by 2 Ice Blocks, tapped once by 2 Ice Blocks, putting it to 3 strength, and then suddenly Madame Medusa would be able to remove a Tamatoa. Of course, in Sapphire with Hiram Flavisham, Ice Block then is also just giving you a whole bunch of card draw. So no surprise to see 4 Ice Blocks in this one. There's also the new card Scuttle, which is tutoring item cards in a similar way to how Ariel Spectacular Singer works, but for item cards. Now, what I will say is Scuttle is a great card if it hits, but if it misses, it's going to feel really very bad. This list is running 14 items, and I don't have the exact maths on me, but because it's going to be the same maths as Ariel, it's around 60%, that kind of ballpark where Scuttle's going to be hitting. So honestly, you would want to play, if you get up to like 20 items, you're looking at roughly like an 80% hit on Scuttle. So it's definitely possible you want to add more items to improve the consistency of Scuttle hitting in a deck like this. But if it does hit, it's going to be great. Of course, it's able to then sing 1 jump ahead, which is a huge deal. So definitely Scuttle is one to look out for in the Sapphire decks. Brawl, a new card as well. Also synergizes very strongly with Ice Block. 4 copies of that in there. There's this new 3-cost Sisu. Now, this is, if I'm honest, the card I would imagine is probably not going to end up making the cut in these decks as the meta settles. This one is an evasive 1/1, which when you play this character, banish chosen opposing character with 1 strength or less. Of course, that does synergize with Ice Block, but being an uninkable card in Ruby Sapphire that costs 3, I find it really difficult to imagine that this is going to be making the cut. You've got cards like Lady Tremaine, Be Prepared, and speaking of Be Prepared, this deck doesn't have any, and this is what I'm kind of saying. We get a good idea over what the strong decks are looking like, but don't expect these to be optimized lists. But it's still really interesting to have a look at them. How Far I'll Go, Grandma Tala, these cards we're used to seeing. 3 copies of the new legendary Sisu card. And this one's really interesting to me because it is a very expensive uninkable in Ruby. While the card looks very powerful, my early gut feeling, having not tested yet the card myself, but just on intuition, is it's going to be a card which you could maybe include 1 copy of, but anything more than that is pushing it. And again, this one, not playing any Be Prepared seems outrageous, but still really interesting to see it. Obviously, Sisu, shift target, Sisu here. Definitely can see the bigger Sisu seeing some play, but I'd be surprised if this 3-cost uninkable is going to be making the cut in these decks moving forwards. All right, let's move on to another deck in the top 8. And this one is Amber and Emerald. And I'm going to be bringing you guys an Amber Emerald deck of my own pretty soon because these decks are really interesting. This one is rocking Kida 1-drop and as well as the Kida 4-drop, which can combine with Under the Sea for a big power play. Under the Sea is putting all opposing characters with 2 strength or less to the bottom of their players, your opponent's deck. So with Kida, every card which is 5 strength or more at the start of the turn can go back on the bottom of the deck. Super interesting combo. My gut feeling is it's a little bit too clunky, like a little bit too memey. I've actually got my eye very heavily on the Muses in Emerald. I think it's possibly the most underrated card of the set so far. I've not really seen anyone playing it. The Muses is working in a similar way to Under the Sea. It's a 4-cost character, which bounces back whenever a song is played, a character with 2 strength or less into their player's hand. So it's like a cloud kicker that's an engine. And I think Under the Sea is a little bit too clunky, little bit too optimistic to be working consistently, whereas the Muses, which is an emerald card, so you could potentially play it in a different color that's not amber, is going to be a little bit more consistent. Really good to see this deck doing well, though. This one's got some Daisy Ducks, Prince John, one Lyle. You've got the new Ursula card as well. I also want to mention that Ursula, this 4-drop, is a Floodborn, so maybe some kind of Bucky Amber deck is also worth exploring. Of course, you've got Ariel. Look at this family, Bruno. A random Chernobog in there as well is pretty nice to see. Overall, that looks interesting. Again, I wouldn't expect this one to be optimized. I think the deck might end up going a bit of a different route. Cricky is also a really nice card for Amber Emerald. Previously, these decks have really struggled with any kind of board control, and now there's an abundance of different options. You've of course got Kidda plus Under the Sea. You've got the Muses potentially with songs like Painting the Roses Red, which lower the strength of your opponent's characters while drawing a card. You've got Cricky. So Amber Emerald, definitely a very, very interesting archetype. I would build it slightly differently though, and it's definitely a deck I'm going to be bringing you guys soon. I haven't had a chance to play too much in the last few days. Up next, we've got another Emerald deck, this one with Amethyst. Emerald and Amethyst was a very strong combination in set 3. This one is looking very similar to the decks we saw in set 3 with a few key differences. Pegasus in this one, not a huge deal. Pegasus being in Emerald and Amethyst because Amethyst already has access to a whole bunch of very powerful 1-drops. You have Chernobog's Followers. You have, of course, the new Magic Broom card as an option, but you've got Pascal. So while Pegasus is a new addition to this deck, it's not making a big impact compared to set 3, whereas Pegasus, for example, in like Emerald Ruby, is a complete game changer. So Pegasus not really improving the deck that much here. There's one copy of Diablo. Diablo, one of the most expensive cards from set 4. Not convinced that it's necessary in this deck when you've got things like Friends, you've got other card draw tools, but one copy, sure. It's obviously a Floodborn as well, so there's some Bucky synergy. Mother Knows Best. I think Mother Knows Best is a big reason that a lot of these lists, the Emerald and Amethyst decks, did really well in set 3. Of course, we don't talk about Bruno. It's kind of working in a similar way to Mother Knows Best, but also getting the discard. Only 3 copies of Ursula seems a little bit odd. 4 Goats, 4 Rabbits, 3 Queen's Castle, and Cricky, as well as this Ursula Sea Witch Queen. So this deck very similar to what we've seen in set 3. Cricky, definitely a nice addition. I think this color combo is really, really interesting. I'm super unconvinced, though, by a lot of the setups I'm seeing. I think the Muses might be the way to go, actually, for Emerald and Amethyst. I think being able to sing Friends, maybe sing Sudden Chill with Ursula while being able to bounce back opponents' cards is really, really interesting. You also could try like a more aggressive approach with this style of deck. It does seem like these Emerald and Amethyst decks are struggling a little bit at the moment, and I could see them being a little bit more aggressive, maybe even removing the bounce package. The bounce package was obviously incredibly strong in set 2, but we're now like 2 sets later, so is the bounce package really cutting it at the top level? I mean, it's certainly good enough, but it's definitely worth considering if it's still the best way to go for Amethyst decks. I think it's really, really interesting. We've got another Amethyst Emerald deck here, looking pretty similar. 4 copies of Diablo in this one. Sir Hiss in the mixer, as well as a way of dealing with evasive cards, possibly like Diablo. Cloud Kicker can also deal with Diablo. Couple copies of Mother Knows Best. Very, very similar list, actually, with just a few subtle differences, like a copy of Pegasus in here. All right, I'm next to have Bucky Discard now. Bucky Discard is all the rage at the moment. And one thing I really love about this set already is the fact that we're seeing multiple ways of building decks with the same color combination. We've seen Bucky Discard now with Emerald Steel, but there's also certainly the option of playing something more similar to the set 3 Emerald Steel decks, where you go a little bit more aggressive. You don't have as many Floodborn characters. This one has 2 copies of Morph. It's got Robin Hood in at 1. No Merfolk, which to me is absolutely awful. Like, you've got to play the Merfolks. Now, full respect to this anonymous player, I'm not wanting to criticize their deck too much, but what's important to remember, in my opinion, about building a deck is, okay, Bucky's going to be very, very strong. However, the meta is going to be dominated quite a lot by more slow control heavy decks. As you can see, the top 3 are all Ruby Sapphire here, although this is a top 4. But Ruby Sapphire is going to be incredibly, incredibly popular and powerful, and therefore a Merfolk on turn 1 is just too much of a good option to be turning down. If you're playing Emerald realistically, you need to be pretty quick, which is why I think it's very interesting at the moment. Bucky is kind of the flavor of the day, what a lot of people are hyping up, which makes sense. Now you've got Diablo on turn 3, right, as a very consistent way of getting Bucky value instantly. There's also this new Aladdin card, which can banish item cards when it quests, and more importantly, it's Floodborn, I do believe. Yeah, it is Floodborn. So with Bucky, that's giving you a lot more Bucky consistency of being able to discard instantly. So while Bucky got a lot better, I think what a lot of, well, certainly this list has neglected is the fact that you're still playing Emerald and you still need to be quick. Otherwise, you're just going to lose to Ruby Sapphire. In fact, a big reason that I initially moved away from Bucky in set 3, more towards like this meta list we saw with Friar Tucks and things like that, was it's just too slow. Bucky against Sapphire decks is just far too slow. Flaversham is just a huge problem for these Bucky decks often. And while these decks go a lot better, this just looks way too slow to me to realistically be what the deck ends up looking like. I think Bucky, super reasonable way to approach these decks, but you still are going to need to have some aggressive approaches like a Merfolk on turn 1. The other things in the day that are interesting, there's still Storm Rage on. No Strength of a Raging Fire, but playing Zeus. That is just something I can't get behind as well. Donald Duck, definitely a much more interesting card when you're playing Bucky. You've got the Jafar card, which is just like a really poor man's version of Friar Tuck. You've got Beast Tragic Hero, Pegasus, Robin Hood. Pegasus is definitely a really, really interesting one with Bucky. Because you can shift in Pegasus, it's going to also enable your Bucky to turn into an evasive character for a turn, which gives you the opportunity to quest for 1, which is not obviously a big deal, but moreover, being able to sing Sudden Chill with Bucky can apply a whole bunch of pressure quite early on. Obviously, Tinkerbell in this one copy of Cinderella, couple copies of Bruno. So Bucky Discard is a deck I'm going to be bringing you guys pretty soon. I think it's really interesting. I also think that it's worth exploring Bucky in other ink color combinations, because you've now got this Diablo on 3. You could potentially play Bucky in Ruby, in Amber. Definitely worth exploring. Who knows, maybe even in Amethyst with this massive Ursula Sea Witch Queen. So Bucky's a really, really interesting one for sure. This deck looks way too slow to me though, and I would absolutely not suggest dropping Merfolk. That is for sure. All right, up next, the top 3, or technically a top 4. I'm not sure if there was a third place playoff. So this is a top 4 Ruby and Sapphire deck. And it looks pretty similar. This one, just 2 copies of Be Prepared. I would strongly recommend playing 4 copies of Be Prepared. 2 Ice Blocks, 2 Shield of Virtues, 4 One-Jumper Heads, 4 Scuttles, 4 Brawls. Also 2 copies of this 3-drop Sisu. We have 1 copy of Aerial Treasure Collector. A really fascinating card. Aerial being able to quest for 5 when combined with Shield of Virtue is a combination I love the look of. Aerial's got Ward. She can quest for 5. Shield of Virtue can ready her with a dime as well. That is 10 lore per turn potentially, which could just be almost impossible for your opponent to answer outside of cards like Be Prepared, Lady Tremaine, and Be King Undisputed, which is this new 4-cost song in Ruby, which is a song with the ability of Tremaine to banish the... well, your opponent basically chooses a card of theirs to banish. So that's one of the only ways of dealing with Aerial. So Aerial's pretty insane. Shield of Virtue, Aerial, definitely a combo to look out for. And yeah, overall looks pretty interesting. Again, my gut feeling would be Sisu's not going to make the cut. This Sisu won't make the cut. Expect to see more copies of Maleficent. Expect to see 4 copies of Be Prepared in these more refined versions of the deck would be my expectation. But yeah. Up next, 2 more copies of Ruby Sapphire. This is the second place. And this Ruby Sapphire deck has 3 copies of Develop Your Brain. It's possible Develop Your Brain could end up being cut from these Ruby and Sapphire decks because you don't tend to have a complete abundance of ink. With the Fishbone Quill, while you're able to ink a card from hand each turn, it's not like you've got a whole new world to just go absolutely turbo ramp mode. So it's possible to Develop Your Brains could be cut from a list like this. 3 copies of One Jump, 3 copies also of this 3-drop Sisu. I'm honestly really surprised to see so many copies of them. Do you think I'm underestimating this big powerhouse Sisu? It's possible that I am. It is possible. Again, I think that the bigger Sisu, sure, but playing an uninkable 3-cost card when you're a ramp deck It just doesn't make much sense to me. I really don't expect this to be seeing competitive play in these Ruby Sapphire lists as things get optimized. 2 copies of Gaston. Gaston's still an amazing card, and this is kind of the thing, right? If you're playing this 3-cost uninkable, you've also got now these uninkable ice blocks. Would you really rather play these Sisus rather than more Gastons? I sincerely doubt it, right? Gaston against discard decks is just such a game changer. Only 1 copy of Be Prepared seems absolutely outrageous as well. 1 copy of Scar, 3 Sisus. And finally, the top deck, I would expect to see more copies of Be Prepared. Obviously important to note that this first place Ruby Sapphire deck won in a mirror in the final. So maybe it's just a deck which is more suited for the mirror. Let's have a look. Also got the Sisus. Now, also bear in mind, this is like a local tournament, right? So I'm really surprised to see all these decks on Sisus. This one has no Be Prepareds. Maybe you don't need Be Prepared anymore. Maybe Sisu is really the way to go. I doubt it. Let me know in the comments what you think. And this is what's really interesting about looking at these local metagame tournaments. You do just see, and also, you know, with the set so early on, 1 copy of Maui's Fishhook, definitely a card which I like the look of. You can do some similar things with Fishhook by giving your cards evasive. 1 copy of Shield of Virtue. Scuttles in there as well. 4 Talas, which I like to see. 2 copies of Bell. 3 Medusas. No Tremaines. No Be Prepared, which seems incredibly interesting to me. Overall, I am very impressed by Ruby Sapphire. No doubt, I think the Ice Block is an insane card considering the Flavasham synergy as well. It is the front runner for me of best deck in the format, but Ruby Sapphire is very slow, and I would fully anticipate lots of decks to therefore be built in a way which just consistently is able to beat Ruby Sapphire, which is why, talking about Bucky, I think Bucky is a great deck, but I think that there's also very much a place for these Emerald Steel decks to be a little bit more aggressive, to consistently be beating Ruby and Sapphire, which is, of course, very, very slow. Although, obviously, if you can Fishbone Quill ramp up into Be Prepared, that isn't the most slow deck in the world by any stretch, but there's definitely room for aggressive decks to be consistently beating Ruby Sapphire. All right, that is the top 8 decks from the Battle Bear trading cards and games. Big shout out to the organizers and all the players for their decks. I really appreciate it. Everyone sharing it. And excited to review more decks in the future. What do you guys think about Ruby and Sapphire no Be Prepared? I don't think that's going to last. I really don't. Thanks so much, guys. Take care.